mentioned, yeah, my partner, who's not here, she's in Cartagena, which sounds very exotic and cool. And I wrote a book about horror and architecture, mainly because we like horror films, we like architecture. It's kind of a very simple outgrowth of our interest, but also for another important reason, which was that we felt that actually monsters and horror are a very good way of talking about architecture. Buildings actually turn out to be something that are quite difficult to talk about. We talk about buildings all the time. In fact, this book is basically just like a transcript of conversations we have inside our car on the way to the office in the morning or on the way back. But the more we would talk to each other about buildings and try and explain them or explain things we found fascinating about them, the more that we started to use monsters as a reference. Like this was a Frankenstein building, or this was a vampiric building, or this was a zombie building, right? So it actually turned out to be a fairly good way of talking about buildings, not so much older buildings, but contemporary and modern buildings, which we felt, for various reasons, which I'll get to in a bit, have a lot of qualities of the monstrous about them. And we found that this was kind of our medium when we would talk to people in our office who are not the two of us, or we talk to students or something, and we kind of try and talk about issues in architecture and architectural language and typologies, which is our fancy way of saying the way a building kind of takes shape and is organized. We found it actually much easier to talk about. So yeah, buildings seem quite simple. I mean, they seem self-evident. We're all in buildings all the time. You think you'd have a way of talking about them, but actually, when architects talk about buildings to each other, they describe in precise ways why the forms are the way they are. That's when everyone stops understanding. So architects are terrible at turning this into a language that makes buildings kind of comprehensible to people who are not architects. And then we noticed that whenever we compare buildings to other sorts of things, like if we talk about, for example, the character of this section, which is Charles Garnier's opera in Paris, although that's not important to the talk, and the section through an old Mini Cooper, there are qualities that you can kind of compare, so that where it might be difficult to talk about that one in the abstract, when we start making comparisons, it actually becomes quite a lot easier. So this is how we sort of began to talk, and at the same time, when increasingly with modern buildings, I mean, if you look over your shoulder at the sort of bizarre, kind of amazing array of forms we have out there, sometimes it's much easier to kind of talk about what they resemble than to try and talk about one of them in the abstract, right? I mean, you can say they're sort of curvilinear and so on, but you hit a limit. For example, okay, I know what we think of now when we see these buildings, but in terms of them formally, if you forget, 9/11, it's hard to forget, but, this is how we were seeing it. These are the Winklevoss twins. But the idea that a building can double and be exactly the same, but be a different object is actually a very kind of strange concept. Actually when they tried to roll out Twin Towers, developers around the world, they found places, especially like in Africa, where twins are often considered to be a very bad omen. It's a bad sign for them. Twin buildings were not a very easy sell. Likewise, this is the very famous, very Dutch MVR DV pavilion for Hanover Expo. We thought of this, right? The Arby's breakfast roast beef sandwich, which, just like this, is intended to have a series of layers in which you can stack anything on top of anything. None of these things have any really clear resemblance to each other, and you just pile them up however you want. You don't think about it as a sort of overall coherent whole like you would with, say, a classical building or a mid-century building. Especially because we, like most architects, love buildings that are unconventional or have unusual qualities that we think are interesting. And a lot of these, again, kind of have this slightly monstrous vocabulary. Like they can be too big or too small, blobby and formless, or they can be made up of lots of pieces that don't seem to go together. They can hide what they are by disguising themselves as something else. We'll look at those in a moment. And they can be hiding something that you don't expect. Even parts of them could actually be dead, unoccupied, or useless. So part of the reason I think that we really love horror films in general is just because they have these creatures in them that kind of break conventions, right? You sort of like in The Fly, you have a guy who enters it's like kind of a transportation unit that allows him to teleport from one place to the other. Unfortunately, a fly gets in there at the same time, right? So what happens is, a few days later, he starts noticing that scales are growing from his skin. So like the way a body is supposed to be, often its rules get kind of messed up in a way that's horrifying, but also kind of like fascinating, right? And that we'd see things that would resemble that the more that we'd watch these movies. late at night. So talking about architecture that breaks conventions, and so this is the question we often ask each other, like, is that building a monstrous building, or is it, is it a conventional building? And we started to break them up into a lot of different categories. Like, for example, these are some of the ones that we started to see coming back again and again and again. So we had things like doubles and clones, where an object is not singular, but then not really plural. It becomes something in between, which is a little bit unheimlich, right? We have things like psychotics who hide a secret. We have zombies that are sort of neither dead nor alive, ghosts and revenants, exquisite corpse vampires, human, animal, uncomfortable hybrids, and so on. So we started to look at the kind of roots of a lot of these ideas. On the left is a kind of very, very old French painting treatise, which is trying to explain how you can understand the character of a person based on the resemblance of their body or their face to various animals. So it's called zoological physiognomy. It was kind of one of those fake scientific movements like phrenology, where your personality is supposed to be able to be revealed or read in the bumps and lumps of your scalp. And at the same time, these ideas of, say, vampirism. So I'll start a little bit with doubles and clones, a very interesting subject. It's a huge philosophical problem, right? The question of individuals. This goes back a lot to people like St. Augustine talked about this a lot when he talked about the Trinity, right? This is neither one nor three nor something in between. It's a unity, but it's a separation within a unity. It's actually a church molding from the UK. So, we started to look at things that struck us as very strange, even though they might be really normal parts of our physical landscape, like semi-Ds, which we see a lot, which have this quality which is a little bit like your kind of so-called Siamese twins, right? And this is the question that we see a lot with problems that still twins kind of face in parts of the world where they're persecuted, because there's this fundamental instability about personhood. Like, are they one person or are they two person, or do we have a kind of like creepy replication? So, we have, though, a whole architectural history of iconic buildings that take precisely this form. And almost, I'd say, most of your major cities or up-and-coming cities at one time or another have had some sort of building like this. There's, where it's a pair. And the way it relates to each other can actually be very different, right? So in this case, it's a very kind of unimaginative pair. What they've done is basically just taking the same building and double it. In other cases, what happens is they start to appear to kind of merge into some common element, like a gateway. And here they're actually quite different. But if we look, and by the way, it's the same developer who did the gateway towers just over here, right? So it's obviously somebody with a kind of a fixation for making these kind of doubles, these pairs, and he's made them all over the world. By the way, it's his career. But they have this kind of oddity, and even more remarkably so when they're joined, right? So this is another kind of old, late medieval illustration of conjoined twins, which have been with us for most of time. And if we look at the semi-detached house, we have this very strange and interesting kind of phenomenon. I mean, what's happening here basically is it's just a calculus of housing cost, what people make and what they can afford to spend on houses, and at the same time, a kind of desire that comes up in the mid-19th century for this kind of bourgeois impression of living in a very big and kind of comfortable and established house. And so these very early illustrations that you see in brochures for semi-detached houses do have the sense of a kind of a large manor house. And what's interesting is when they start out like this, they hide one of the doors. So somebody has an entrance on the front and someone has an entrance on the side, and the whole illusion is supposed to be that you live in a rather large house, when in fact you only live in half of it. So they employed all of these different architectural tricks to kind of conceal where the lines were between the two. And as this happens, as these go on, they become much less skillful and much more kind of nakedly doubled, right? And so you can sort of see how, in this case, what they've done is they've doubled the house this way, and then they've kind of done a little bit of reflective symmetry to make it look like the whole thing is one nice big house occupied by a single family. So what happens, though, in many cases, is that while the twins are there, they grow up over time and they become to be very different characters. And this is something we see a lot as a literary trope, right? When we see twins, very often, like, one is jovial and happy, the other one is morose, like one is psychotic, the other is peaceful. Like, this is something that we see kind of play itself out endlessly in films and in literature. And there is a kind of an architectural analog. So this is near my house. It's a very interesting case where two houses that were built at one point speculatively for two clients, and they started out exactly the same, right? They both probably look more or less like this one, and what's happened is there are two neighbors. One is kind of hugely exuberant and very public in his character, very kind of flamboyant, has a lot of disposable income, and loves the whole kind of the public life, right? He wants everything he has to be shown. The other person is kind of morose and inward and isolated, and they block out their windows. Sorry, this odd light, so you can't really see the details, but what's happened is they basically put several layers of facade where the windows are. They're the actual windows, and then they're kind of blinds, and they're chains, and then there are burglar-proof screens, and so on. So it has a very kind of dark and impenetrable kind of fortress-like quality. Yeah, so they have this hilarious kind of a unity where you start to read kind of characters in them, right? So your extrovert as opposed to kind of your introvert character. One is a highly colorful house. So in the front here, this is several different shades of marble that are in this kind of crazy interlocking pattern, whereas this is just kind of gray washed, kind of a beige color. In fact, the whole house is fairly beige. There are very few differentiating features in this. Like the whole thing more or less looks the same. Whereas this guy sees everything as a sort of individual project, kind of bring it out and make it as excellent as he possibly can, right? So there's a floating glass swimming pool over here. There's glass shutters. He's got his little kind of tea terrace out there, and then more of a different kind of cracked marble pattern on that side. A lot of ornamentation versus plain. Yeah, I mean, even the front is kind of hilarious. In fact, this person has made a kind of a nice little bonsai garden for themselves. This guy just has the DB box and like not even grass growing on the ground. It's the kind of maximal contrast you can imagine. And then, architects also kind of seize on this, right? The architects who are very interested in this kind of strange quality between one object and two, and the kind of middle ground. So this is the Pritzker Prize laureate, great architect, Alejandro Aravena, who did a science building, a kind of campus building that starts out as one and splits into two as the two sides, the medical science and the pure science, diverge. They kind of have their own towers that reach toward the sky in a slightly different direction. They look like they're kind of trying to lean away from each other. This was a really incredible house by Johnston, Markley, Sharon Johnston and Mark Lee. And this was for Ordos, this very strange kind of utopian art village project in Mongolia that we also participated in, which, like a lot of utopian projects in China, kind of just suddenly stop and the client just sort of disappears. But what they did in this case was to imagine basically two families occupying the same house. The brief for this house was very strange, by the way, because every house was 1,000 square meters in a desert in Mongolia, 50 miles from any neighboring town. And the idea was that art lovers were going to go out there, and with their one child and their 1,000 square feet or 10,000 square feet, we're going to just occupy this desert and fill it up with Warhols and other kind of expensive. And there's an art gallery in the middle, which was actually built and is now kind of like decaying. The rain falls in through the roof and stuff. So we often have many more than two, right? So replication is one of the modern forces that we see that starts to introduce a kind of very uncanny idea into the city and into architecture, like the idea of of the little boxes, the famous song, right? Which is this is Levittown, which is a kind of an early post-war suburb in America. This is where GIs who had come back from World War II and had a little bit of money and were going to get educated on the GI Bill. This is where they were starting their families up. So this kind of origin of American commuter suburbia, but the idea, a very strange and new idea in America, that you would take one house and you would replicate it over and over and over and over again with only very, very minimal differences between them. So it's a little bit like a kind of a clone situation, right, where we have the same object, which is supposed to be highly personal and highly intimate. It's your house. It's supposed to express kind of the character of your own family, but every single one of them, more or less, is exactly the same. And I think what we see in this is a kind of 1950s drive toward homogenization, definitely, and conformity. But we see this also. It's not just an American example. This is a European example. This is in Switzerland. These are all kind of post-war ideas about trying to balance the individual and the collective in some kind of architectural form, but using the language of industry, mechanism, and repetition. So there's a quite famous Walter Gropius project, a Siedlung, which were kind of idealized new urban living. But we see it here too, right? The kind of the sublime and also kind of slightly terrifying quality of just repetition, which is just unleashed either vertically or horizontally. So again, architects have fun with this. This is Peter Eisenman, who has done some of the most amazing and the least amazing projects of the last 40 years. So this one, where he's looking at a research institute that specifically does genomic research, and he has a series of kind of rules that replicate almost genetically from generation to generation. And it's a relationship between the skin and the frame. You know, for example, where a frame emerges, where it seems to be partially buried and sort of penetrates in a strange way and is covered up. And so from generation to generation, it's kind of same but different. So he's looking for something like, I guess, family resemblance, right? Where you can have 3 or 4 siblings that obviously are of the same DNA, there's the same stock, but they vary slightly from person to person. So they have this interesting balance of individuality and sameness. You know, and the question of whether sameness is kind of a problem or repetition is a problem is an interesting architectural one. I think it changes with time, right? I mean, there was a time where, specifically when I would show people photos of Singapore back in the US, they would kind of find something like this incredibly terrifying, right? They find the idea of the HDB block terrifying, whereas I think when you're surrounded by it, you start to actually notice differences between them, or just find the sameness very sublime. It's kind of an interesting problem. So, you know, in other cases, what we see is a very effective use of that, right? Where, so this is fat, who are kind of seen as extreme postmodernism, kind of hard postmodernism. They continued to do postmodernism after it was kind of a reviled thing, especially in the UK, when nobody wanted to have anything to do with it. They kept on. They just, you know, they went back to Venturi and did the same things again. But they started to do it in an almost kind of cartoonish and excessive way, but using its techniques very skillfully. So when we look at something like public housing, the way that they kind of try and use things like ornament or differentiation to balance between something that could be very much same, too much sameness. And so where we would see often, especially in brutalist English examples, where there would be just a kind of an unthinking rollout of the same unit over and over again, sometimes joined, sometimes separate. What they're trying to do is move against that in a slightly more kind of narrative vocabulary. So then we were also looking at something which we termed kind of the exquisite corpse, right? So full of parts that kind of match or don't match to a certain extent. They don't match perfectly. They mismatch, some more so, some less. And you know, this is a term, of course, that comes famously from surrealism. It's like a parlor game, right? It's like, we all do this when we're kids. You fold the piece of paper 4 times and you draw one thing and then you pass it to your friend and they draw the next. And nobody sees what anyone else is drawing. And so the result can be kind of anything. And so this was one that, you know, that this was how I guess the surrealist artists kind of partied back in the day. Like, this is a collection of pretty amazing people doing one drawing all together. And I guess the idea was that a kind of collective aesthetics gets you away from all the problems you have with the individual artist, right? The individual artist has all these kind of questions of subjectivity and positionality and singularity, and this allows a group to kind of break through the stranglehold of that. You know, and we see it in a lot of different ways. These are all, I mean, architects love these images, right? Because this is the kind of the architectural problem with the human and the mechanical, which is kind of a weird obsession that our profession has. So the idea of making work that on the somehow is kind of post-subjective or post-human, but at the same time kind of beautiful. This is a very sort of architectural fixation. So we have for a long time, though, within that, you know, Hieronymus Bosch, these kind of amazing, say, ungrammatical kind of bodies that go together in the strangest possible way, right? And so it's really a kind of a classic way of making the horrible, because it has this fundamental thing where it breaks down the sense of singularity or oneness. So in the sense of clones, for example, or Siamese twins, it has a kind of a similar dynamic. It's taking the singular thing we're comfortable with and breaking it up. You know, and we see this a lot also, you know, in the kind of classics of corny Japanese monster films and so on, which are super great. Or something like John Carpenter's The Thing, which is probably the most, it's like perhaps like the great expression of body horror, right? But the thing about The Thing is it's this creature that wants to replicate using other people's DNA, but it can't do it perfectly. So it's kind of always failing. So these are like collectible toys of like horrible scenes from this movie. I don't know who buys this shit. But like, so these are actual scenes from the film. This, you know, so basically what happens is it takes over a dog and it kind of tries to replicate the dog, but it can't quite get it right. So it's got limbs in all the wrong places and it's kind of bodily incoherent and it's super gross, right? So, I mean, this, if you saw the movie Annihilation recently on Netflix, which is kind of a much more beautiful version of this, where plants are trying to do the same thing. It's a kind of inexact or imperfect simulation that we see in this kind of thing. But in this, what we get again is this kind of failure to capture the grammar of the human body in the way that we love it. But again, it can also produce things in collage, ideas of juxtaposition, which are also incredibly exciting. So what's amazing about it is that it has a kind of a level of monstrosity where we see the conventions that are being broken or being reassembled, and at the same time we see the possibility of a lot of new things. It's like there's another John Carpenter makes a career out of this, right? So he has a movie called Videodrome, where like people start to actually merge with like video cassettes and video cassette players and televisions and stuff. And one of the characters, at first he's horrified by his transformation, and then afterwards he kind of like becomes the advocate of this kind of new way of being. And he says, "Long live the new flesh!" The new flesh is this thing that looks like you've eaten a television set or something. But yeah, a lot of objects that we see still kind of have these kind of the most unexpected juxtapositions. And for things like, particularly for me with my own architectural training with people like Koolhaas, the idea of collage, which starts to kind of come back into architecture in the 90s in a really huge way, and is now really something that people work with very aggressively. And for a long time, the language of modernism is very smooth and very consistent, very anodyne, very beautiful, very coherent. And what Koolhaas does is he comes back in with a collage and kind of starts breaking it up and kind of breathing new life into modernism by precisely playing games of exquisite corpse with its various antecedents. So that's, again, where kind of the logic of this comes from. This is where Dutch architecture circles back towards something where what they do on this pavilion is kind of create an almost, it's almost like a kind of a racist monument that the Dutch do about themselves. It's like Dutch landscape. So you have one level is like the polders with like tulips growing. The next one has like something else, and then in the middle there's a kind of a Dutch restaurant that serves really bad rijsttafel, and and so like they just kind of stacked everything they think of as being kind of touristic associations of Dutchness like into one single building. And they don't really. What's kind of beautiful about it or powerful about it is they don't have to worry about the consistency. They don't care about that anymore. All of its dynamism, its magnetism comes from just this kind of brazen stacking of just whatever they want on top of anything else. And this is a trick they do a lot, right? It's a thing, it's kind of a cultural foment that's happening in Rotterdam and Amsterdam at a particular time. It's this famous silo-dam housing where, unlike one housing block where we're used to, having some sort of consistent treatment, say, of all the units together and treating it as a singularity, they're calling out every single unit in the block of flats with a different facade material, almost like you kind of stacked houses and then compressed them, rather than treating the whole building as a singular entity. So they're running kind of very dramatically in the opposite direction. So there are lots of versions of this. This is Venturi, Scott Brown. This is one of the projects that made their career as postmodernists. It was an early work by them. Actually in the early 60s. It's pretty radical for an early 60s building. This is Koolhaas. Gursky's photograph of Kopan, which is a kind of a bizarre, kind of highly vertical, defensive type of Brazilian urbanism that we see now based on a lot of different kind of social architectural conditions. And Gehry, who is the kind of the master of this, right? He's another one of the great forces that brings back this idea of differentiating all the parts in the building and giving them their own character. This is almost like a kind of caricature of that, where this looks like a whale and it looks like a sausage, and one thing looks like a little house. And, it's a way of, basically, as he described it, of taking, again, a 10,000 square foot house and making it seem like a collection of tiny houses rather than expressing it as one very big thing. And it's kind of a fascinating way of doing it. He does it over and over again, right? And so this is a house in Venice where basically what he's doing is he's taking the Torii Gate, he's assembling like all of this kitsch elements from Venice Beach architecture. So this is the Torii Gate from a sushi restaurant. This is like one of the little cabins where the like Baywatch, was the lifeguards, they like go up there and they look. So it's actually, this is a screenwriter and that's his writing study, but it's treated like a Baywatch type, lifeguard station. And it works because he's really good at it. When we see like a hack architect try and do that, like here in Tel Aviv, the results are kind of fascinating. I mean, they're startling, but I know it's not, it's probably not beautiful. Maybe some of you will disagree with me. And this kind of juxtaposition can also be like very scary. So Henrique Oliveira is quite an amazing kind of Brazilian artist who takes houses that are being demolished in areas of Portugal, right? Not in Brazil, Portugal, and he works with wood by wetting wood until it becomes a kind of skin-like, or like it's this kind of like adipose tissue. It's like fat, right? It's being like kind of, and it always is kind of pushing its way through and into and out of the architecture to the point where you kind of can't tell where the architecture is in any kind of perfect state anymore. It's become beautifully kind of deformed and also horrible. And the interiors are amazing because, of course, they're formed by the inside of these kinds of spaces. And he's doing this as a way to talk about kind of disposable architecture, about the body of architecture and the body of the city. Particularly in cities like Porto, where architecture, of which probably has undoubtedly heritage value of one kind or another, is being demolished to put up kind of fairly generic kind of contemporary buildings. This is the kind of the streetscape, and they're just kind of left in situ. I mean, it's not really treated like an artwork in any kind of gallery framing. It's just kind of you encounter it on the street. It's a pretty horrifying thing. Yeah. So, you know, I mean, it's amazing, right? That the old fencing is kind of halfway disappearing. It's like when a tree grows through a fence. I don't know if you've ever seen that. When they start to merge, it's an incredibly creepy thing. And he kind of simulates that because he can play with these architectural materials in a way that takes them very close to kind of biomorphic materials. No, it's actually in Portugal. And you know, sometimes the most interesting examples happen just because as architects we're not good enough to deal with the complexities of the program, right? So this is in Colombia. It's a cathedral in a valley that also had to be a bridge and a weapons store. So not weapons like a storage, not like guns there, right? But it stored kind of gunpowder and things when it was initially built, right? So what this architect has to do is take this incredibly inhospitable terrain, put something which he thinks is cathedral-like there, merge it into a bridge, and then put it on something that has to be very fortress-like. So if you look at the relationship, look at how much detail and depth there is in this facade, and how little there is down here by contrast. It's for a couple of reasons. One, because this is fortified, but the other because this is a base and this is a superstructure. This has to be really heavy because it has to support that. I mean, this is a masonry building, right? So it's a very strange thing where you can't tell, like, is this supposed to be a tower? Or is this like a base? If it's supposed to be a tower, why is there like kind of like a walking deck around here? Maybe to get up to this side, you know, and the bridge kind of leads directly to the church, so you could go through or you could go around the outside. So it's a completely weird and incoherent way of kind of bringing the parts together, but it's probably much more interesting as a result, I would argue, than if somebody kind of somehow managed to give this a kind of a perfect normative expression where all of the parts are very normal, right? Like for example, if they had made the base a completely different material from the top, or the bridge a completely different material, you know, yet again, we'd have something that was much more normal. It'd be like a building on a podium, whereas this is something that's much stranger because he's trying to unify the whole thing in a way that kind of brings it together, but also makes it incredibly weird as a result. You know, these are just love this niche with the statue. Wow. Yeah. So I mean, again. Going back to, not to kind of repeat this or bludgeon it to death, but the idea here that you know, there's a huge instability here about one thing or many things and how those parts relate together into a whole, and it can't seem to find any conventional vocabulary to make that work. So it's making up its own rules, and that's when it seems to become super interesting. Yeah, psychos. Right. So I mean, this is something also. If you've gone to the NLB show where we kind of look at urban horror. Psychos particularly, this is kind of an interesting thing, right, about the psycho, where it could be anyone. I mean, often when you look at kind of actual medical literature on psychosis, what psychotics are really good at doing is making themselves seem like you see them and you wouldn't even remember them. Like you meet them, you have a small exchange, you go somewhere else and you ask what they look like, you can't even recall. I mean, there's a sense of the person as a total nobody, but inside them is this incredible potential for violence, which is a very kind of unusual characteristic, right? And you know, they have somebody else inside them. They're literally kind of like two people, but unlike the kind of Siamese twin where you're physically conjoined and you're two people, what you have inside is this sort of this psychosis where you can have multiple personalities, you can have very unexpected behaviors that suddenly change, and that sort of thing. Right? So the idea that the interior doesn't match the outside is another incredibly kind of rich area of architectural horror. And we have in a lot of things, incredibly, I would say even more so now, where buildings have kind of started to become very problematic in the way that the inside and the outside relate, right? Like the classical notion of modernism is that the facade is super honest. It's just this glass sheet, and you look inside, and whatever's going on inside, you see it from the outside, right? There's no problem that the facade doesn't misrepresent itself, which is like super different from this, right? The original version of Westworld, where things have external forms, but what's in the interior is something that you would never expect. It's something completely out of character. And it could be ominous, right? So the original archetype of this is the Trojan horse, right? The kind of soldiers on the inside and the outside looks like it's a gift. We have a lot of kind of almost literal Trojan horses in architectural history. I mean, a lot of things like from roadside attractions, right? It's like Coney Island where you get to climb around on the inside of a huge elephant. Or somebody taking the old lady who lived in a shoe kind of concept very literally. But there are a lot of these things where the outside becomes kind of very, very divorced. And what's interesting about the interior in this, the minute the interior doesn't have to have any relationship to the outside, it can be kind of anything. The interior becomes the space of total fantasy and potentially terror, kind of depending on what kind of an interior we imagine. This is Werner Panton's like hangout space. You can still buy these components and like create this room if you want to. You can get them from Vitra. It's like kind of a space of, I guess, like from the era of like Barbarella and kind of like 60s movies like that, soft spaces. And this has like a lot of kind of very traditional credentials, like buildings that we have where typologies exist, where they come to be. They evolve in such a way that we can't possibly, even if we wanted to, make the outside and the inside work well together. This is something we have, for example, in the great opera houses. Right? So all of the interiors of these great rooms and their technical requirement of having, for example, sets that come up and down, fly spaces, all of that kind of thing. If we look here, these are really a set of individual architectures that are kind of just put together in a train, and then they kind of put a shed roof over the whole top. So you have these amazing situations where out of this entire depth, the spaces that human beings can inhabit is actually like that high. The rest of it's just padding that either makes the building on the outside look normal or it gives it a kind of a technical insulation layer that it needs just to function. So we have spaces like this that kind of grow up very normally, or they come out of other kind of functional requirements, like going back to the Mini. I mean, what we see in resembling the theater is the fact that actually the outside has a completely different requirement from the inside, right? The outside is supposed to be more or less aerodynamic and smooth. It has to have a sort of simple efficiency of its surface, right? All of that stuff. The inside has all kinds of crazy stuff that just have to kind of live in it, or have to be comfortable when you sit down, or have to provide a steering wheel. And those things have like nothing whatsoever to do with each other, right? This kind of comes from a lot of great sources like that. It's not actually a church. That is a bunker disguised to look like a church. It houses military observation point, and the whole point was they thought that like the Germans couldn't be so inhuman as to possibly bomb a church, right? So we'll make it look like a church, and no one will bomb it. And it's actually, from close up, it's amazing because it's like 3-foot thick concrete walls. It has no kind of churchness about it, but it's just the outside form of the cross on the roof. And of course, the Germans do bomb it, right? Which is why it's like standing at an angle like that, which kind of makes it even stranger. It kind of gives you some clues that it's not probably what it appears to be. China. Trojan horse is alive and well in China, right? I mean, and this is Vegas in China, right? The idea that the outside of the building is just a kind of a spectacle, and the inside is a hotel, or it's an office building, or whatever it needs to be. Or the outside is auspicious, or it has good symbolic associations, or it's going to draw clientele, whatever that is. So this is a kind of 60% scale Ronchamp by Le Corbusier. It's in China. Inside was a steakhouse. So to give you a sense of like the radical juxtaposition between insides and outsides, like this is probably as crazy. I mean, because this isn't even indicating. I mean, apart from, sorry again, the lighting isn't super great, but there's this kind of horrible commercial rendition of like a kind of a Chinese garden bonsai art, kind of hedge work around the outside. So you could kind of get a clue it's not the real thing, right? But the sense that it's only 60% of its actual size, or that it's a steakhouse, is really kind of pretty surprising still. Zombies. We have a lot of these. Increasingly in America. We don't have very many of them here because there's a greater kind of efficiency of land use, but the US is full of dead buildings that still kind of exist. If you go, we have in fact like kind of large neighborhoods that are dead. If you go to Detroit, which I really suggest to do, you can see these kind of incredible civic architecture that represented a period when cities like Chicago and Detroit were expected to grow well past New York and become the kind of the great kind of urbanized center of America along the lakes, and now kind of just stand in a relative state of kind of disrepair. The one on the left used to be a train station, right? The one on the right was a kind of big civic downtown building, administrative building. And they sometimes kind of take on other kinds of associations. They take on other kinds of programs. So like we have what used to be theaters in Detroit now, which have kind of been paved over and they're becoming parking structures. So people actually park their cars underneath the great kind of painted ceilings. And so it can happen for a lot of reasons. This is, for example, in Cyprus, which is in a kind of demilitarized zone, which is between Turkish and Greek claims on the island. This was in a James Bond movie eventually. It's one of the Japanese kind of coal and steel working islands that was off of the main coast, which is now completely, it's kind of, if you've seen Isle of Dogs, it's kind of inspired by these kinds of landscapes. Or underneath New York City, where there are all these incredible kind of Beaux-Arts train stations, which are no longer used because they're not on the existing lines. They're just sort of there. Yeah, so I mean, we have a moment where a certain kind of architecture becomes obsolete for whatever reason, like regime change, right? This is a stadium in what used to be Zaire, right? And underneath was this famous kind of torture complex where the secret police kind of had all of their rooms where they would take political prisoners and so on during that time. So, you know, you'd have this kind of crazy bifurcation of what happens above, which is like national spectacle, and what happens below, which is like torture. Or dead malls, right? I used to go to this mall. This is near where I went to college. We saw like all the Tarantino movies in here when they came out. Like, it's completely dead. There's even one in Thailand that has the whole ground floor is flooded, and they're using it for fish farming. And the escalators are coming out of the fish. This is now completed, but for a long time this was kind of the apex. This was like the iconic building in the Pyongyang skyline. Was this hotel, which is intended to symbolize kind of the mountains of, you know, the Korean Middle Kingdom, and you know, they just couldn't finish it. It just stayed like this, and it's a really, really tall building. And now you can go and stay in it. But you can imagine that looming over the city when all the windows were dark and no one was there. And so, like, for example, in Detroit, right, so we have this crisis where what happens is these houses are, people pay to have them demolished because basically they become crack houses, they become hangouts for criminals of various stripes, and then they bring kind of this problematic danger into the neighborhood. So there are companies that are paid like $50 a house just to go around and on a charitable basis destroy completely inhabitable homes, you know, that have just kind of become shabby due to disrepair and the fact that the industry moves on. So this is far away. This is in Germany. This is amazing because this is not in Detroit. This has the opposite problem. It's the second floor of an incredibly expensive shopping street. And what's happened, you know, in Bonn, and this happens in other German cities, is that the ground floor of the high street becomes so successful, so expensive as real estate, that it makes more sense to remove the staircase to the second floor and use the floor area that the staircase would occupy, because that square footage under the staircase is worth more than the entire second floor. So they cut off the second floor, and that's what happens. Like, there's just pockets of completely dead, inaccessible, uninhabited space that's just there because of this kind of weird inhuman economic calculation where you want the stair space to sell stuff and not the whole second floor, and because people don't really live there anymore. So it becomes a ruin. And we get this kind of strange thing where, you know, classically we imagine ruins in this very romantic way, like Tintern Abbey, or the scene from like Nostalgia by Tarkovsky, where it's, you know, this kind of thing, not to be kind of within existing buildings where you're shopping downstairs, but the upstairs just happens to be a ruin and there are only pigeons living in it. And we get a lot of waste of this kind. Again, this looks like a wonderful kind of burnt out Tuscan ruin. It's in China, next to a fabrication plant. So there's kind of strange. And of course, you know, kind of our acts of God, like huge potholes and things, which now actually are kind of increasingly happening because of, you know, climate change. We're seeing now this kind of increase in the violence of storm systems and that sort of thing, which destroys cities in kind of an unremitting way. I think lastly, I just want to talk about gigantism, frightening size. Again, this is something that's been around forever because architects have always had tremendously huge egos, and they like to make big things that look like this. Big phallic objects, which is like the mainstay of the profession, especially with the utopian. The architect's utopia is basically just a huge erection. But, you know, anything I think that is too big or too small, you know, I have this debate with, do you guys know Rohan? You know Richard Manson? So I really want this rabbit. I want it in my house. And Richard sees this as revolt. Like, he can't see this picture without like his stomach like he's so uncomfortable with it. It makes him nauseated. To me, it's just fantastic. But, you know, the idea that this is not Photoshop, this is actually a German giant rabbit. You can buy these, although they're illegal in Singapore now because a few people brought them in and they couldn't feed them the tons of, you know, Timothy hay that they need every day to kind of keep them going. And they didn't want to clean the shit and they smell terrible, so they got kind of abandoned, right? Or the opposite, where we have this kind of homunculoid figure, right? Where George Grosz looks at one of his kind of muses was this a joke. But also, you know, if we look at horror films, sorry, this is super dark, but this is the first scene in Alien, which is an amazing scene because you don't ever really see everything that's on the screen. And, you know, when they go to intercept this beacon, a distress beacon from this planet, and they find a crashed alien spaceship, everything in it is scaled to kind of these giant figures, right? This kind of dead guy who's reclining in this control seat, and his chest is burst open, right, because it's alien. And they climb to it through a kind of a series of stairs, which are scaled to that size. So you see these guys in spacesuits that are kind of trying to get up these stairs that are like 1 meter in height, and the sense of like being out of place, the kind of the alienness of that setting is really incredibly evocative. And they do that very well also because you never see anything. There's a kind of a moment where Ridley Scott always makes a kind of a visual area and everything else is dark. This has been used a lot to kind of express classical civilizations, right? This is a very Orientalist kind of set for Aida. Or again, like in another thing architects love, huge spheres. They love huge spheres. So, in this kind of rhetorical, say French, like 18th century architecture, which is supposed to represent the values of kind of enlightenment and science and rationality, we have a lot of things that are like regular things, but they're huge. What's interesting about this, though, is it's not just that they're big, right? We have a lot of buildings that are very big, but what's happened is nowadays we have various vocabularies in architecture for very big buildings. So we have a very big building, we have a way of making the facade that's very abstract, so it kind of diminishes its size, or we break it up into components. We have all these tricks, right? So there's a moment in time, and this is something we really focus on in the beginning of the book, where buildings suddenly become super huge, and there is no architectural language to account for that. So what they do is they try and take the language of a really small building and apply it to a really huge building. And so we get these super freakish, like this is, that's supposed to be like a sort of a Cape Cod cottage, right? This is probably supposed to be like a 2-story building with an attic. You see the size of the people, it's kind of like this gigantic, inhumanly scaled object. And so there's a lot of time that where this is what happens. We get monsters when we have new requirements, but we don't have the skills to kind of deal with them. And so people kind of try anything that they can. They try the old tricks, and the old tricks kind of don't work anymore. And then people start to kind of get very clever, where they try things like setbacks and these kind of techniques that we eventually come to, which become the kind of founding elements of modern architecture. And of course, it's used ideologically, right? So this kind of great Soviet era metropolis-like architecture where everything is of such a superhuman scale. And there always seems to be a statue of like a really muscular man like holding up a globe or something, doing labor, something like that. But we still get this, and we get this in contrast. So this is, I'm not implying that this building is bad in any, I love this building, but if we look at the contrast between it and what's going on around it, I think this is one of the best ways to understand kind of maybe land values and land prices in Singapore, is to go and like stand right in front of one of these buildings and kind of look up at the scale of kind of human density that we get, especially with this building, because it seems to use this patterning as a way of, in a way that to me kind of really kind of sort of celebrates density. It looks like a microchip or something. It doesn't necessarily look in any way like a series of flats, and they haven't done anything to try and make it quaint or break down its size. They really emphasize the size as much as possible, and it makes it kind of amazing. The other effect of this kind of urban economy, as we see in Japan, is the idea of something going very, very small. So we see something here, which is an 80 square foot house, which is expressed like a little house with a little roof, but it's really the size of one room. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny house. And actually, when they photograph these in Japan, you think, wow, this is so nice. It looks really roomy. And then the minute somebody like strays into the photograph with like a bicycle or a dog, and you actually see the real scale of what these houses are like. It's kind of amazing. And America, God bless America, right? This is like where we have America and China again, and we get, I love the scale, right? You get Mount Rushmore and you get the U.S. Capitol, but it kind of has like the gardens of Versailles sticking out the front. But everything in here is tiny. So when people actually walk into the frame, they're like this high. Everything is this kind of weird miniaturized scale. So there are others, and I won't go into them because obviously things that are distorted, right? This is a kind of classic of the expression of various kinds of discontent. Bacon did this in the most horrifying possible way. I think Margaret Thatcher called him the little man that paints those dreadful paintings, right? Because everything has a kind of a sense of trauma that he's trying to express. But they can be really beautiful, right? Again, Frank Gehry is the master of beautiful distortions, and here MVRDB again with this building, which is quite amazing because it doesn't have any consistent set of stairs or ramps. The floor is like topographical, and it's just like climbing a hill from the bottom to the top of the building. It's a very strange and amazing kind of way of moving around the building and encountering it. Or accidental things like this, the Chesterfield Spire, where basically they used different wood on two sides, and one of the woods contracted and the other didn't, and so turn like that, right? So, I mean, it's a kind of an embarrassment, but now Chesterfield is famous, and tourists go to kind of stare at this incredibly distorted church spire. But you know, again, we do have these kinds of things, right? It starts to look like when the country mouse goes to the city or whatever, kind of old cartoons that we know, but where people actually use a kind of a visual distortion to kind of create something that's a little bit like a kind of a crazy house or something that's definitely for touristic kind of input, right? Solidity, you know, there's actually a really interesting book that just came out yesterday about this, about underground. But you know, places where we live against impenetrable solid masses of a kind that so dramatize the difference between, say, human spaces and kind of geological and mineral spaces, their compactness, their density, their strata. It's something ultimately uninhabitable right next to our architecture. And this is an amazing town, by the way. You should totally go. It's a beautiful town, and there's great food also. But it's all built underneath the lee of this huge kind of inclined piece of mineral that sticks out. And they used it as a way of kind of protecting the town originally, and they kind of grew together. Or cases, we have a lot of this in Turkey and in Iran, where things were kind of at least partially carved and partially built, and very often the built part has fallen away, and what we get is this incredible architecture that looks like it was kind of imprinted. Some of the most amazing of these are in Ethiopia, where they have churches that are excavated downwards. I don't know if you've ever seen those. They're incredibly beautiful, and basically they would find, instead of building up, they'd find a rock and dig down until they got to the bottom, and when they would kind of get a big lump in the trench around it, they'd start to go through the windows, and they'd carve facades, and you have these churches that are made out of one piece of stone. So they sort of, again, these classical kind of romantic, sublime ideas. And then we have this kind of whole tradition of human-animal kind of hybrids, or natural human hybrids. Again, this is like Swamp Thing, this is Creep Show, this is like so many different kind of classic kind of horror tropes that we get in one place. And what we have here is this is Nick Knight and an Australian artist collaborating on these kind of very weird suits that they put on people, and this one is full of seed and it grows. This person that walks around with these huge burlap sacks and they water him, and eventually this stuff starts to kind of grow out the sides. It's pretty amazing. This was like a great scare tactic, right, in Victorian newspapers, that if you drank all of these kind of green juices, I guess it's the old version of like our current celery juice craze, right? Like in London, at a certain point, you want to get back to nature, and they start taking all these natural powders and juices, and this is the same. Basically, you're going to turn into a part vegetable. You wake up in the morning looking like that. But you know, it's something that kind of some of our strangest and most elegant architects have experimented with this. This is one of the halls at UC Berkeley. And it's something now, right, which is back in a very big way. There's Woha, right? This is near Moulmein, Emilio Ambas. Your sort of beautifully, classically overgrown churches, or Hundertwasser, like these are buildings now which we're seeing as being kind of green and good because they're